Well, my name is Mark Moore, and I'm the director of the Hauser Center for Nonprofit Organizations at the Kennedy School here. And I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's panel. I'm very pleased and proud to be co-sponsoring this important panel with my colleague Julie Wilson, who is the director of the Wiener Center for Social Policy at the Kennedy School. So this is a joint production, if you will. My sole function tonight is to introduce a man who needs no introduction. That much they trusted me with, it turns out. But since I don't think that's going to take much time, I thought I would just take the liberty of saying a few words on why I think this is an important subject. One of the reasons is that I'm a father, and I've been fortunate enough to be a father in relatively secure and fortunate circumstances, and I find the job incredibly demanding and exhausting. And when I think about the difficulty of doing the same job under less than the ideal circumstances in which I've been privileged to live, my heart quails. And I keep thinking of all the ways and all the things that we must be able to do to help fathers become the kinds of fathers they want to be in adverse circumstances. The second thing that I think is important to understand is that, or one way to understand the mission of the Hauser Center, is that the Hauser Center is interested in a set of institutions that lie between individuals and the polity. And important ones there, of course, are church and community. But you might think of that the most important organic element of an individual's connection to society and to collective and community life is a family. And so I'm intensely interested in the opportunities for strengthening America's
inner city will be those that address behaviors, attitudes, and norms while at the same time focus on ways to open the structure of opportunity so that fathers can realistically envision a better life for themselves and a real chance to care adequately for their children. But these are my views, and they may not be shared by members of this panel. The panelists include Dr. Ron Mincy on my far right, a senior program officer of the Ford Foundation in New York. Mincy led the non-custodial parents issues group for the Working Group on Welfare Reform, Family Support, and Independence in the Clinton administration. He received his A.B. from Harvard College in 1974 and his Ph.D. in economics from MIT in 1987. He has numerous publications on urban poverty and income security policy, and in the fall he will be visiting Princeton University to teach and co-author a monograph on strengthening fragile families. Mincy will be our first speaker, and he will talk for 15 minutes. He will be followed by Dr. Jeffrey M. Johnson on my immediate right, President and CEO of the National Center for Strategic Nonprofit Planning and Community Leadership. He has been widely quoted in national newspapers and has appeared on CNN, the Fox Morning News program, the Jesse Jackson Show, NBC Nightly News, and National Black Network News. He received his BA, MA, and Doctor of Philosophy degrees in urban education and management from the University of Michigan, and he is author of several publications, including the books Endangered Black Male, The New Bald Eagle, and Fatherhood Development, a curriculum for young fathers. He will also speak for 15 minutes. Following Dr. Johnson will be Marilyn Ray Smith on my immediate left, the Chief Legal Counsel and Associate Deputy Commissioner for the Child Support Enforcement Division of the Massachusetts Department of Revenue. Former president of the National Child Support Association, she is a graduate of Smith College and Northeastern University School of Law, and she has authored numerous articles on child support enforcement, and she's co-authored a book entitled Enforcing Child and Spousal Support, and she will speak for 7 minutes. And finally, we will hear from Stan McLaren, who has been working in the maternal and child health field for the past several years in Boston. He has a background in finance and accounting and has been responsible for managing a major federal grant that impacts the health and welfare of women and their babies in the greater Boston area. And for the past 3 years, he has been working actively in the fatherhood movement at the grassroots level in Boston by establishing a male service program and by convening traditional family service providers to consider the impact of absent fathers and to design strategies that will establish the link of fathers to their children. He holds a BA in economics from the University of Massachusetts, and he will also speak for 7 minutes. And then following the presentations, we will have a question and answer period. So let's begin with Dr. Mincy.
Thank you. The core subject that we want to talk about this evening, and we do appreciate this opportunity to share with you and to get feedback on these ideas, is a demonstration called Partners for Fragile Families, which is taking place in 10 sites throughout the United States, mostly urban sites. And this is a public-private partnership between two stakeholders whose external circumstances were changed quite radically because of the Personal Responsibility Act. The two stakeholders that we're talking about are community-based responsible fatherhood programs that have grown up in the last 20 years all over the United States, and local offices of child support enforcement, which have been basically in business primarily since the mid-1970s, when the federal child support program was created. Now, I want you to understand that child support is the second leg of our income security policy. The one you hear most about, however, is welfare. But these two programs work in tandem, and in our recent welfare reform, the notion of personal responsibility and work is about enabling mothers on welfare to go to work and to achieve self-sufficiency, and to ensure that support for children also comes from fathers. And this illustrates the child support program and the welfare program working together. Now, the Partners for Fragile Families Project was designed to commit local child support enforcement offices and community-based responsible fathering programs to the task of working through a process of change that was brought about by the Personal Responsibility Act. Since the mid-1970s, most dependent child families consisted of a mother and children who became poor after a divorce or a separation of a previously non-poor married couple. The father, usually the higher earner, left the household voluntarily or involuntarily and took his money with him, leaving the mom and child poor and dependent on AFDC. The relationship between the parents had gone through a complete life cycle and was over. And the appropriate role for government was to see that he continued to support his children and reimburse the state for public benefits that the mother and child received. In most instances, this was primarily an issue of enforcement because he had the ability to pay. The federal child support program that was created in the mid-1970s was created for this purpose, to collect child support, and assumed for the most part that collecting from fathers who refused to pay was the main mission. And that program created in the mid-1970s is still the program that we have today, driven by the same set of assumptions about the population that it serves. Over time, the Office of Child Support Enforcement has developed increasingly effective strategies to collect child support. It has improved powers to do so, and in the Personal Responsibility Act, there was a mantra out there: nothing is certain but death, taxes, and child support. Now, my friend and colleague Marilyn Ray Smith is among the most innovative professionals in this field. However, the composition of dependent child families has changed radically since the 1970s. Today, most dependent child families began their poverty as a consequence of a birth to an unwed mother, not a birth to a married couple which later divorced. And this has several implications. First, when a woman is married, her mother is, the husband is assumed to be the father, and therefore child support enforcement knows who to go after in order to collect child support. However, in a situation in which a child is born to an unwed mother, paternity first has to be established in order to as a prerequisite for child support collections. And so over time, as the rate of unwed births now, about a third of all children in the United States are born out of wedlock. As that rate has gone up, the responsibility of establishing paternity as a precursor of child support has become an increasingly important responsibility of the Child Support Enforcement Office. Secondly, over time, the federal government has increasingly encouraged through incentives and sanctions the Office of Child Support Enforcement to establish paternities. Now, usually married couple families, the fathers in married couple families have higher incomes than unwed fathers, and as a consequence, it has not been in the long-term interest of the Office of Child Support Enforcement to go after these paternity cases. They are rewarded, they have been in the past rewarded on the basis of collections, and why spend lots of resources going after a guy who doesn't have much money? So all of this has changed because of the emphasis on paternity establishment, and that change reached its zenith in the Personal Responsibility Act. Because the Personal Responsibility Act requires all states to make progressive progress toward establishing paternity for 90% of children who are born out of wedlock in the state, and it penalizes mothers for failing to cooperate with the paternity establishment process. Now, those sets of changes, moreover, the penalties that states incur for a failure to make progressive progress is that they lose significant amounts of their TANF dollars, so that the sanctions for this failure are more serious than they've ever been before because we have block grants associated now with our welfare and child support programs. Basic thrust of what I'm saying is that the Personal Responsibility Act has radically changed the world that Marilyn Ray Smith and Stan McLaren, who manages one of these community-based responsible fatherhood programs, live in. All right. However, a more significant change has also occurred. Despite the growth in out-of-wedlock births, our income security policies continue to assume that most children born to unwed parents needed the same things that children born to divorcing parents need. They needed the money from the fathers in order to support their well-being. In 1994, after having worked for not more than 6 months, but studied this for some time, I began to challenge that view of the needs of poor children who are born out of wedlock. I argued essentially that for the disadvantaged at least, many unwed births constituted the beginning of a process of family formation, not the end. And that many of the fathers were actively involved in the lives of children. And it appeared to me that besides the money, the children also needed the active involvement of the fathers in the lives of the children and needed a number of civil society institutions to help nurture and strengthen the relationship between their parents. I also argued that if the Personal Responsibility Act, if government was now going to require parents to establish paternity in order to receive welfare, and was going to penalize the mothers for failing to do so, that government was creating a certain amount of static in the relationship between unwed parents, and government had the responsibility to help these couples manage that static. Now, basically, those were a set of hypotheses that were developed in the early 1990s, and now we know a whole lot more about how those hypotheses are really playing out. Maybe we have the first slide. I want to show you a set of charts now that are coming from new research being produced by the Urban Institute and by Princeton University and Columbia University on what really is the status of children who are born out of wedlock and their families. May I have now the first slide? What this slide shows is that unlike the 1970s, most poor children who are in the child support enforcement system are born to unwed parents as opposed to divorcing parents. And this creates a radical change for the world in which child support enforcement lives. What this means is that, again, you have to establish paternities, and you're not dealing with a case in which the dad has an income, and it's a question in my mind as to whether or not the primary role of government is to collect the money. I raise the question, does government have a role in strengthening the relationship between these parents? Because clearly, this is potentially a process of family formation at the beginning, not the end. May I have the next slide, please? What this chart illustrates, and it's rather complicated, I just want you to focus on one thing, and that is the lightest portion of this chart. 1/3 of all children in the United States are born out of wedlock, but when those children are between 0 and 1 years old, 27% of those children are born to what I call fragile families. Families in which you have a poor mom and a poor dad, they're disadvantaged, the children are born out of wedlock, but the couple is cohabiting or the father visits the child once a week. Again, 1/3 of all children are born out of wedlock, and for more than 1/4 of those children, the father is actively involved. What this suggests to me is that, again, these children do not need the same thing that children of divorced parent need. What they need, in addition to the father's income, is support to engage both parents in the life of the child over the life cycle of that child. May I have the third chart, please? What this chart indicates is that this is a phenomenon that is true not only of poor children, but of children quite generally. These are children who are born out of wedlock, and what the chart basically shows you is that 62% of children who are born out of wedlock have the benefit of the involvement of their fathers during the first 2 years of their lives. May I have the next chart, please? Finally, this is another set of data that indicates that for poor families, mothers are telling us that 51% of those mothers are cohabiting with the fathers of their children, and an additional 30% have a father that is highly involved. May I have the next chart, please? These data are hard to see. They basically indicate that fathers who fail to pay child support fit into two categories. They are dead broke dads and what we call deadbeat dads. They're broke dads or dads who fail to pay child support, but they have a very low income. If you will notice, their incomes are stacked at the lower portion of the income distribution, and their median incomes, that is half of them, have zero income in 1996. Going back to Bill's point, if you're going to get child support out of these dads, you're going to need to create a process by which the fathers are enabled to pay, and then if they refuse to do so, child support enforcement kicks in. And then that's the last chart I want to refer to. Now, the basic then objective of the Partners Project is to help local child support offices and local community-based organizations that work with fathers and families work out a new situation for these new data. How is it going to be that an agency that viewed its primary role as collecting from dads who had the ability to pay, how are they going to work with this new population of dads who clearly do not have the ability to pay but are actively involved in the lives of their children? On the community-based responsible fathering program side, they spent most of their time avoiding child support. They did not want to engage child support because they knew that child support's only interest was to collect the money from the father. However, in order to facilitate the connection between fathers and mothers, and to live in a world in which paternity establishment is required or the mother is punished, these community-based organizations have now got to rise to the challenge of working with child support enforcement and facilitating that connection. I think I've given you a basic overview of the new world in which these two agencies exist. And the singular purpose of the Partners for Fragile Families demonstration is to create a laboratory for CBOs and for child support enforcement officers all over the country to figure out how are they going to cut this deal. I will make a final point. The fourth goal of the Personal Responsibility Act is to encourage the formation and maintenance of two-parent families. My question to the Congress throughout has been, what does that mean for communities in which most children are born out of wedlock?
Dr. Johnson.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Wilson and Ron. And Ron, as always, has eliminated the need for me to be statistically relevant. And what I'm going to do is piggyback on some things that he said to really give some sense of this partnership between child support enforcement and CBOs. Let me date myself in this work. I go back about 12 years, specifically around the community-based responsible fatherhood work, having the responsibility for writing the curriculum for two social welfare demonstrations focused on fathers. One was the Unwed Fathers Pilot Project. The second was the Parents Fair Share demonstration, which has been the two largest social welfare demonstrations looking at these issues associated with fathers. And now I have the fall guy position to also be responsible for the Partners for Fragile Families demonstration supported by the Ford Foundation. You know, Ron says that when he's inside the Ford Foundation, he's the fall guy. Outside the Ford Foundation, I'm the fall guy. And so, but let me talk about the Personal Responsibility Act in terms of priorities that create the reasons for, if you will, for this partnership between child support and community-based organizations. First of all, to understand the Personal Responsibility Act in terms of its primary emphasis is to change welfare as we knew it, which essentially moves it from an entitlement program to a time-limited program. That's critical because what we're talking about is that when a mother signs up for cash benefits, she's also going to be offered the opportunity to go to work pretty quickly to make money in exchange for those cash benefits. But at the same time, what it means is that the time when she starts receiving those benefits now, the clock starts ticking, and she has 5 years. That has caused a lot of pressure on the part of child support on one end, CBOs on the other end, in thinking about how to begin to think about working with this father in a different way. So time limits are critical because it moves the welfare program from an entitlement program to a grant program that's 5 years. The second thing it does, and Ron mentioned this point, is that mothers are required now to cooperate with the government in locating the father for purposes of paternity establishment. For those of you who don't know exactly what that means, paternity establishment means establishing legal fatherhood. Now, in order to get a child support order, you must have the paternity established. And so now mothers have to cooperate or be penalized a minimum of 25%, and in some states, like Georgia, they're withholding all the benefits until the mother locates father. Now, or identifies father. Now let me tell you what the problem that presents. What it does for the first time in terms of the expectation of child support is put in front of child support a person who they have to collect money from who doesn't have any money. What it fundamentally does is put child support in a position to be for fathers with the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, or the new AFDC program called TANF, is to mothers. To really begin to think about, if a father is located or identified by the mother and can't pay child support, what in the heck do you do with him? When child support's primary mission has been collections. The culture of child support is collections. You know, the biggest challenge that the CBOs have had in work with child support around this issue is whether or not it would change child support into social workers. Child support people do not see themselves as social workers. I'll let Marilyn talk a little bit more about that later. But the other thing that it raises, particularly with the forced, the requirement of having to identify these fathers, it also creates new tensions in the relationship that could lead to domestic violence. And I can tell you, immediately after the Personal Responsibilities Act was passed in 1996, a lot of the initial meetings between child support and people represented on the community-based fatherhood side had to do with, what do we do if domestic violence shows up in these situations? And so the Personal Responsibility Act has created more tensions in the relationship between mom and dad, and may cause more strains than really facilitate the process of putting him in a position where he can pay child support. It also has, going back to this whole father situation, it really does put child support and the government in the position of thinking about the best way to respond to the needs of an unemployed or underemployed father who can't meet the basic financial requirements of the child support order. And so in many respects, what it's done is force child support to rethink its basic collections mission, to include a focus on enabling fathers who can't pay for child support to be in a position now to work with them to be put in a position to pay child support. The other things that the Personal Responsibility Act has done that has really precipitated this partnership with CBOs, the focus on 90% paternity establishment in the out-of-wedlock birth cases should really has to be understood, because what it does, it puts child support in a situation where they have to work with fathers that they have not prioritized in the past. These are fathers who were the hard-to-serve cases in the child support program. Now, you got to look at every father as being a father who you got to bring into the system to really improve your performance around paternity establishment. And I think that this has, again, opened up a new way for child support to begin to think about its work. The other thing that the Personal Responsibility Act does is also encourage child support to do outreach in the community for purposes of increasing paternity establishment. Now, understanding the mission of child support going back to the early days of child support, again, it's always been collections. Now we're fundamentally talking about child support going out in the community and being perceived by the community as being a resource to the community on behalf of child well-being. Now, I don't need to tell you, some of you may have your own direct experience with child support, and y'all know this applies to all child support people other than Maryland. But the point is that child support is not seen as a community entity at all, and is seen as very adversarial, and is seen as part of the criminal justice system. And so a lot of community organizations are not waiting with open arms for child support to come. They see child support literally as the Darth Vader, of the family support world. And that's something that child support has to deal with as it begins to outreach to the community. The other problem is that a lot of child support people, since their primary mission has been collections, don't know a lot about community-based organizations. I can recall being in a meeting very recently with a whole group of state child support people and having my presentation interrupted to ask me what CBO meant. Of course, I facetiously, she said in the beginning, the Congressional Budget Office. Then I said, community-based organization, which represents an organization who works on behalf of the social welfare needs, principally of poor families. Okay, and so that's critical. So there's some things to be understood on child support in terms of work with CBO. So that's part of it. So that was the child support aspect of this. That's what the Personal Responsibility Act has kind of caused. On the CBO side, it's also caused a lot of challenges to reevaluate how it works with fathers. Let me first say that given my work in these programs, most of these programs have been underfinanced, and so they really don't have a solid track record of really being able to provide what I might call a full menu of services. You know, what you find most of all is community-based programs doing the best they can. They're bringing fathers together. They may have some peer support component, but they're not doing a whole lot in terms of job development. They don't have the resources. They're not doing a whole lot in terms of documentation in these programs because, one, a lot of CBOs, you know, it's mission first, some of the management considerations second. You know, and so they really don't have a good handle on evaluation, and even if they did, they would have the money to pay for it. And so these are the things that really have challenged CBO involvement in this work over the years. But more importantly, as it relates to the Personal Responsibility Act, they know, the CBOs know now that because of some of the requirements of the Act on the TANF side, they have to think about, in the context of the mother being penalized, whether to encourage the father to cooperate with mom, or not to cooperate like they've done in the past, thinking that if they turn the father, or if the father cooperates, he's going to put himself in a worse situation than what he is right now because of the pending child support order. The other thing that it does is that it causes a concern on the part of CBOs whether or not they will lose the trust of fathers. What most fathers that we serve know about child support is not anything formal. That's the other thing that CBOs have had to do. They've had to learn about child support. A couple of years ago, we had a conference down in Atlanta. We had about 300 practitioners down there who work with these type of fathers, and I asked how many actually knew about child support, and about 15% of the hands in the audience went up that actually knew child support. What they know more about child support is the horror stories encountered by fathers who had a default order put on them as a consequence of not coming to court when they were supposed to appear to really formalize his paternity, and then when he was finally picked up by the marshals about 2 years later, and I emphasize that because it takes some time to really catch up with this guy. And then when he finally shows up, he goes to jail. And then when he goes back on the street, he says, let me tell you, child support is not about you. You know, it's part of the criminal justice system. And, you know, all they're doing is locking up us. But the reality is that this father, neither the father nor the CBO knows a lot about child support. So they got to learn more about child support. And then it becomes really making a determination how much to work with child support in such a way that they not create an image of the program that pushes father away or does not attract fathers to the program because of a perception that if they go to the program, it's somehow going to be an environment, a smoke out for child support. That's a big thing because the trust aspect is the real heart and soul of these programs that work with fathers. And so they've had to deal with this whole issue of what will our clients perceive as being the child, how will they be perceived as a result of work with child support. The other part of it is that the CBOs fundamentally have to begin to work with dads in more comprehensive ways. It's more than just peer support. It's employment. It's education. It's those things that Dr. Wilson talked about that's going to enable him to make a labor market attachment and get a job that not only pays a basic minimum wage, but also gets into the job market where he gets on a career trajectory, where he can eventually make wages enough to have a family-sustaining wage. And I can tell you, the fundamental attraction of fathers to these programs that Stan runs is the job. That's what he wants. He wants a job. But jobs are not enough. It has to be jobs with wage growth, particularly if his child's on welfare, because he's going to have a child support obligation, and he has to be able to meet that child support obligation and also fundamentally be able to take care of himself. And so the idea of this kind of self-support element is also critical in understanding how these relationships have to sort out some of the issues. Let me now move and talk about the Partners Project in particular, and to talk about how we're getting at some of these issues between child support and the CBO. First of all, it's very, very difficult. And that we had to engage in a planning process of about a year and a half and to really get child support and CBOs to begin to talk about a common vision of working together on behalf of their children. And simply that's it. You know, that the common denominator for both the CBO and the child support enforcement is that they both see themselves as being in existence for the well-being of children. They just have different missions. And so the whole first year and a half was a sorting out process of getting to know each other's missions, learning more about what the agency does, and also coming to some level of agreement of how they were going to work together on the Partners Project. And there are two types of agreements that we had them actually establish for purposes of administering the program and then creating a service infrastructure that will respond in what we call a way that responds to fragile families, fathers in fragile families. Understanding that the focus on fragile families means both parents and not just mom and child. So the first set of agreements were what we call cooperative agreements. And the cooperative agreements were centered around the fiscal management of these programs and also the general administration of these programs. And let me say that trying to get the sites to really come up with these cooperative agreements has been very, very difficult, and it's still unfolding in terms of finally what will make those cooperative agreements work. And the issue fundamentally centers around who controls the money. There's some fear that if the money in the project is administered by child support, the child support will maintain some of its traditional tendencies and not really operate in this kind of new fashion that's required under the Personal Responsibility Act.
Jeffrey, how much time do you need? You got 2 minutes.
2 minutes, all right. The other part, the other issue is the fact that the CBO may or may not have some of the management competencies to be able to administer those monies. Now, some of the CBOs are part of larger family service agencies, and so that family service agency is in many respects have demonstrated competency, but some of the CBOs are new and just starting out, and they have not necessarily proven themselves from a management standpoint of being able to run these programs. The other set of agreements has to do what we call the partnership agreements, and these kind of specify the specific services to be provided. They include, on the part of child support, working with the CBO to set up what we call a volunteer paternity establishment site on the part of the CBO, and also child support positioning itself to modify orders should a father get a job and lose that job for some reason. So that's part of that infrastructure. The partnership agreements also relates to the services provided by the CBO. The CBO provided services in peer support. They also focus on a new focus on parenting that we call team parenting, TEAM, which is a system designed to work with never married couples so that they can work out parenting plans for their children in a similar way in which the court assigns a mediator to divorcing couples to do a parenting plan. They also have the responsibility for developing jobs for these participants. The partnership agreement also calls for relationships with groups like substance abuse providers, domestic violence service providers, legal services, housing, and so in effect what you do is create a infrastructure of support on behalf of these fathers so they can assume the responsibility for supporting a child, so when that child leaves welfare, the child will have the support of both parents and not just one parent. I will be interested in responding to questions should you have some, but what I want to do is really give you a sense of how the partnership, we forced the partnership to come together and how some of the partners have kind of sorted out some of their, continuing some of their issues as they try to make this an effective partnership on behalf of children.
Thank you. Marilyn Ray Smith.
Okay, thank you. I just want to say what a pleasure it's been working with Ron and Jeff. They have an amazing capacity to persuade and recruit, and they really are enjoying an extraordinary success in shaping the national agenda on responsible fatherhood. And I've seen them in action in front of congressional committees. I know they have contacts in the White House. They're certainly changing a lot of the ways that we are doing business in state government, and their work with community-based organizations and child support has really just been truly amazing. And it's really just wonderful to work with them. It's really inspirational. I wear at least two hats. You already heard that I'm the Chief Legal Counsel of the Child Support Enforcement Division of the Department of Revenue. I also serve as the Executive Director of Governor Cellucci's Commission on Responsible Fatherhood and Family Support. And these two functions dovetail quite nicely, and they're serving as the vehicle through which the responsible fatherhood agenda is being developed in Massachusetts. Child support is taking the leadership in Massachusetts, as it is in a number of states around the country. And basically, we are working very hard to translate Ron's vision into action. And first, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Governor's Commission and give you a different perspective, because I think they've done a terrific job of explaining what's going on in child support, and I would just be redundant. And then talk about some of the changes that will have to take place within child support or are already taking place. The Commission came out of a summit that was convened by Governor Well in June of 1996, where we heard presentations from national leaders describing the negative consequences to children and society when fathers abandon their children. These data are now familiar to all of us. Scarcely a week goes by that the newspaper doesn't report how children growing up without a responsible father are 5 to 10 times more likely to be poor, twice as likely to drop out of high school, more likely to end up in foster care or juvenile justice facilities. Girls are more likely to become unwed mothers. Boys are more likely to be incarcerated, unemployed, or uninvolved with their children. Massachusetts actually has one of the lowest divorce rates and one of the lowest rates of children born out of wedlock in the country, yet every year 14,000 children in Massachusetts see their parents separate or divorce, and another 20,000 children are born out of wedlock. More children are born out of wedlock in Massachusetts and in the country than whose parents divorce. So that means for us in the Commonwealth that 34,000 children a year begin living in a single-parent household. So to get an organized response by state government to the crisis of father absence, Governor Weld appointed a commission which chaired in the beginning by Lieutenant Governor Salucci, and now the governor continues to chair it. He comes to every meeting as the level of his commitment to this issue. The commission members represent a wide variety of state agencies, from Health and Human Services, Public Safety, Welfare, Health, Social Services, Education, the courts, district attorney, individuals from faith-based and community-based organizations, mentoring, parent education, job training. And we really tried to put together a cross-section of agencies to provide a forum for coordinating programs and initiatives across agencies so that we could have an organized strategy for bringing the issues of responsible fatherhood into the mainstream of public policy and service delivery to families. Because one of the first things that we found is that fathers are absent not only from the homes, but they're also absent from the development of public policy and in the delivery of social services. The Commission issued its first report last June. The bottom line of the report was that we should focus on the best interests of children and not on the rights of parents, but on the responsibilities of parents to work together for the good of their children. Because there's a lot of evidence that show that children benefit when parents cooperate, and children suffer when parents engage in intense conflict, particularly family violence. The Commission has focused on 3 key areas: jobs, nurturing, and marriage. The first is jobs. As we've heard here, certainly with our distinguished panel, that a father's ability to provide is a necessary, though not sufficient, prerequisite to responsible fatherhood. A father who cannot provide financial support is at risk of becoming uninvolved with his child. He will either drift away or he will be pushed away, whether or not he's married to the child's mother. The second issue is nurturing. We were looking at strategies for assisting responsible fathers in developing a nurturing relationship with their children and in working cooperatively with the children's mother, again, whether or not they are married. And finally, the issue of marriage. The unifying purpose of the Commission is to prevent father absence. And one important way to do that is to strengthen marriage and reduce the number of children born out of wedlock. If our social goal is to provide children with the financial and emotional support of 2 loving parents, there's no easier or more cost-effective way of doing so than through the collaborative, committed, and caring partnership of 2 married parents. Even the most successful child support initiatives in the country yield but a small percentage of paternal income. And the most elaborate plans for visitation support centers and shared parenting plans fall far short of the ideal of 2 responsible, involved parents who are living in the home with the child. And this is from the child's point of view, not necessarily from the parent's point of view. The Commission certainly recognizes that marriage is not always possible or even desirable in all cases, and we also recognize that many single mothers and single fathers are raising children and doing an outstanding job against the odds and often at great personal sacrifice. But as we advocate for more services for fathers, the Commission is not advocating to take resources away from mothers. Rather, We believe that the most effective way to solve the problems of fatherlessness is to view the welfare of mothers, fathers, and children as intertwined and interdependent, not as a zero-sum game in which the father's gains become the mother's losses. And it's been very important in the political process to attend to this, because that's the first concern that is not often stated, but it's often in the room. Some of the recommendations of the Commission range from including low-income fathers in welfare-to-work initiatives, encouraging health professionals to actively teach new parents how responsible fatherhood and cooperative parenting foster child well-being, to develop community capacity to help divorced and never-married parents resolve their conflicts through mediation and counseling, and to work with the law enforcement community to help inmates who are fathers make a successful transition back to the community. What I'd now like to do is to turn to what's happening in the child support program, and what's happening in Massachusetts is similar to what's going on around the country. As both Ron and Jeff mentioned, welfare reform has made child support more important than ever. It didn't take long for policymakers to realize that welfare moms going to work needed more than their paycheck to survive. So a sea change is taking place within child support agencies around the country. It's slow and steady, and as I said earlier, a lot of it is the work and the partnerships and the relationships that Ron and Jeff and their colleagues have developed. The mission of the child support program in recent years has expanded to include emotional support as well as financial support. So for the first time in the more than 20 years of the history of the child support program, we are actually looking at the connections between visitation and child support compliance. Interestingly enough, the data show that when there's child support payments, the father is more likely to visit. There's a stronger correlation between paying child support and visiting rather than visiting and then paying child support. So it's a little bit that the heart follows the money. And just as they both mentioned, welfare has traditionally been the gateway to services for low-income moms, and child support is being identified by the Department of Health and Human Services and the Clinton administration as the gateway to services for low-income dads, particularly getting them into jobs. And it's been an interesting transformation for us in the child support program because we spent years developing tough enforcement tools. We have sticks for those who won't pay, who could pay but won't. We garnish wages, we seize bank accounts, we can send negative credit reports, we can revoke passports and driver's licenses. There's basically hardly a situation where money changes hands that the child support program hasn't figured out how to be at the table and make sure that we get our cut. But we're now also starting to work more on voluntary compliance and developing sticks for those who would pay but can't. And so we're expanding our Seek Work programs in the courts. As I mentioned earlier, we're working with the welfare to work initiatives to make sure that funds are made available to low-income, non-custodial parents. We've been inviting dads along with the moms to job fairs to meet employers. And we've started recognizing and honoring fathers who are separated from their families who do pay on time and in full in the recognition of that commitment that they're showing. And we have received 2 demonstration grants that Stan will talk more about to work with unwed fathers in Boston to address basically any barrier that the father encounters on the way to responsible fatherhood. And these barriers are many. They include a poor school record, weaknesses with literacy, poor work history, substance abuse, criminal record, and large child support arrearages that may appear overwhelming. These last 2 pose some interesting public policy challenges. How do we give a helping hand to fathers who may have broken the law or failed to support their children and who are now ready to embrace responsible fatherhood without somehow sending the wrong message to those who played by the rules from the beginning? The government's very good at negative incentives. Oh, one more minute. How about that? So I just want to end with several questions that we can ponder and discuss more. How can the child support program strike the right balance in the world of automated case processing where we use a computer to send out literally thousands of wage assignments and bank levies at a time? Where every case looks the same when the certain criteria are met. How can we provide individualized assessments, even to refer low-income fathers to these case management services that are being developed when we're in court with more than 100 cases on the docket and the court is pushing us to move as quickly as possible? A very important part of child support is that it becomes unpaid child support becomes a judgment by operation of law. So judges are not allowed to retroactively modify orders. So how are we going to develop equitable rules for suspending arrearages so that there is a reason for these low-income fathers to come in out of the cold and to face up to their default warrants and to clean them up and to go forward? Are there ways that we can use our connections with the law enforcement community to mitigate the effect of criminal history when a low-income father is ready to go look for an employment and to turn his life around? So the interesting challenge for us is going to be, how do we use our sticks and carrots, and how do we decide? We definitely need both. A carrot is not effective unless you also have a stick. We really learned that with child support over the last 25 years. So we need both. But the challenge for us is going to be, when do we use which one?
Thank you. Stan?
Okay. I guess I'm going to start by saying it's funny, it's hard being last. Dr. Johnson, you worried about Dr. Mincy stealing your thunder with stats. You've stole my thunder with what we were going through with regards to our relationships with child support enforcement agencies. And you've kind of stolen a little bit of my thunder also, Marilyn, with your profile on what these guys tend to look like. So I guess, Dr. Wilson, you're not going to have a problem with me coming at the time. So with that said, I'll get right into it, I'll get out of it, and we can start going right to questions and answers. Basically, I run the Father Friendly Initiative, and our program is basically set up to reintegrate the male back into the family. What we found in support services is that the family, quote unquote, meant women and children. So we tried to do a different thing, to deal with the man holistically and try and reintegrate him back into the family. So I want to just give you an idea of what these men look like. I'd like to first say that they come with a lot of baggage. Many of them come from fatherless homes themselves. Many of them don't even have a clue as to what positive relationships should look like because they themselves weren't raised in one. Most of them, like Marilyn said, did not graduate from high school. They don't have GEDs, and worst of all, they have no vocational skills that are going to give him some viable trade to be able to meet the obligation. And they do come with criminal records also. So we have those barriers, and then we get into the institutional barriers that these men tend to be in. They tend to have higher unemployment rates, low pay scales, higher incarceration rates, and for African American men, their perception of the justice system as having dual standards. There was a stat that came out in the Globe, I think it was in February, that said 1 in 10 black men will be incarcerated by the year 2000. I think we're exceeding that stat, I'm not sure, but that's 2 months away. So we got to think about how that impacts on their economic outlook. So they come to our doors, basically, as you can imagine, angry and frustrated. And the frustration plays out in different ways. It plays out in substance abuse, which is really hitting a lot, especially around African American men. It plays out with criminal activities, and it plays out in domestic violence. So here we have an undereducated, underemployed, over-incarcerated men now trying to deal with the advent of welfare reform, and here comes child support enforcement, and which, to be honest with you, they view as just another way or another system that's going to incarcerate them or jam them. So with that said, I just want to talk a little bit about these fathers and how they feel. I mean, many of them do want to be responsible, and they do want to provide support for their children, financial and otherwise. But they find their efforts blocked by the very systems which purport to encourage responsible fatherhood. Inconsistencies and contradictions in the regulations or related systems at times have an effect of disqualifying fathers from supporting their children. For example, some men are rejected for employment in jobs for which they are well qualified because of criminal record check, because a criminal record check reveals their past incarceration. Many of these men have completely remade their lives and demonstrated through years of dedicated action that they are ready and willing to be responsible fathers, community members, and workers. Yet they face repeated rejection in their quest for employment, rendering them incapable of meeting their child support obligations. Only by coordinating the rules and regulations of relevant systems and by introducing some flexibility in how policies and procedures are applied can these fathers hope to fulfill their desire and the system's mandate
to provide adequate financial support for their children. There are many systems that fund programs aimed at low-income fathers. And here we have a few of them. They have stated that their goals are to promote fatherhood responsibility. However, systems which should span Department of Labor, Department of Revenue, criminal justice system, transitional assistance, housing, education, health care, and both the federal and state levels have not coordinated their efforts to be reinforced and complementary. Without mutual engagement, as well as thought-out methods of planning, implementation, and evaluation, the potential for positive outcomes of programs like mine will be thwarted. If one impedes rather than supports another, the result is stagnation or worse, regression. On the other hand, if strengthening fragile families and support for fathers' involvement and responsibility becomes a unifying goal across systems, with co-commitment action at the highest policy levels, the results may exceed all expectations. I thought you were time, and I cut out, I was ripping apart stuff as you all were talking, so I hope I'm okay. Thank you very much. Okay, we're now entering the question and answer period. There's a mic there, and a mic over here, and a third mic somewhere. So if you could come to the mic and direct your question to one or two panelists, please.
Hi, I'm Karen Kalish at the Kennedy School, and I want to know what's being done. I have two questions. What's being done in the elementary and the junior high and even high school level to educate these young people coming up as to consequences of many things, but including fatherhood? And number two, which is the state that's doing the best job in this area?
You want to take that one, Ron?
Well, I do know that there are, several years ago, the whole emphasis around teenage pregnancy prevention began to be informed about the role of men in teenage pregnancy prevention. And so now it is not unusual to find, well, first of all, studies of male involvement in early sexuality, and then there are health classes, but there's also, from the fatherhood sector, increasing efforts to engage boys in school about with messages about pregnancy prevention and the like. And I think that those efforts have a limited potential because it's hard to get young people to focus on the consequences of decisions that seem so far away. What we know is that young people who become sexually active, men, boys who become sexually active at 12 to 16 years old are most likely to sire children out of wedlock and least likely to support them. So the notion of getting these early messages early is the right one. The question is, who is the most effective messenger? And this is why our work really focuses on men who have children and who haven't been able to achieve what they said to themselves: my father deserted me and I will never put my child in that position. And then they grow up having children out of wedlock and unable to meet their own self-commitment. I think that men who go through that process and are transformed as a consequence of it are the best messengers for younger people. They can influence their younger siblings, they can influence their et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it's important to not only get to this whole idea of influencing boys in their sexuality, and to influence them in the way men think about sexuality. We're just learning about this. That is to say, how do you talk to men about how do you manage your sexuality? I think that we've got the message really wrong. I think that we've been trying to send a message to teenagers about boys, about pregnancy prevention, when it is clear that I'm 40 years old and I'm married and I need to learn how to manage my sexuality, and then I can have a free and flowing and an honest conversation with my son who's 21 years old about how to manage his sexuality. So I think a big part of it is, again, beginning with people who have made some mistakes and have recovered. They're the most effective messengers to talk to young people about what they need to do.
Is it going on?
No, it's not going on.
But there is, and I know Marilyn probably wants to speak to this as well, there are programs like Dads Make a Difference that are being implemented by child support enforcement agencies. There's a group out of Kansas City called the National Center on Fathering that's doing some things in the school system. The focus is on early childhood development to work with parents of children entering school. And so they are happening. But again, I think that one good way to understand this work is that it's still evolving, it's still new, and there have not been sources of funding for this work other than private support. And in the long haul, you really can't depend on private support for sustaining this. It really has become a public policy issue, and as a consequence, resources to expand these things in our school systems, but also in our community organizations, because I agree with Ron. I do think it's a question of who is the right messenger of these things, whether that's family, whether that's community, whether that's a school. It's probably a combination of all of them to some extent. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Jordan Moranis. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. I also wrote about 6 years ago the National Governors Association's paper, issue brief called Toward Responsible Fatherhood. And I've been familiar with Dr. Mincy's work for a long time. I appreciate the distinction that Dr. Mincy made about looking at how to increase the active involvement of children in the lives, of parents, and especially single fathers in the lives of their children. Until just about a minute ago, we hadn't heard anything about early childhood education, about Head Start, about the Newborn Home Visiting Act, and those types of movements across the country. I'm curious about each of, or any of the panelists were, and if there has been a concerted effort to actively utilize the early childhood education system, in particular Head Start and Newborn Home Visiting, to bring fathers more into focus around the education and the health and well-being of their young children.
Let me say that very definitely. We have a national partnership agreement with the National Head Start Association. Matter of fact, we've created the Fatherhood Initiative, and we're actually having a retreat on this coming Thursday. And it's leaders in all aspects of Head Start, from the Indian reservations to other types of programs in the Head Start, early Head Start, and the like. And what we're trying to do is fashion an approach to expand this whole focus on father involvement in Head Start programs, with a particular focus on early Head Start. If you think about the data that Ron showed you, it really did demonstrate that we have a golden opportunity between the ages of 0 to 3. And that these are your early Head Start types of programs. And so we really want to focus in on that. We did a survey of about 2,500 Head Start organizations. There were a number here on the East Coast doing some things. Again, the issue of limited understanding of what this work is all about, limited funding, has precluded some of them from really doing some of this. Some actually said that having 1 or 2 fathers involved on their policy councils was father involvement. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about connecting biological fathers to their children and working with those biological fathers who are poor in such a way that they can sustain their involvement in the child's life over their child's lifetime. And so Head Start is definitely being worked with. We see it as essential for our work. You should also know that most of the referrals of fathers who voluntarily establish paternity are from programs that service moms, because the referrals of the fathers come from the moms. Because we really have not created an infrastructure yet that we can say in all certainty is going to attract fathers to these programs, and the programs that existed thus far have been court-ordered and mandated fathers coming to these programs. We got to move beyond that, because again, it's about getting fathers to volunteer, but also once they volunteer, help them manage all the risk associated with coming formal dad, which means working out relationships with moms, striking a deal with child support around his child support payments if he and mom decides not to marry. The other thing that Ron probably wanted to say and didn't is that in addition to those couples in the Fragile Family and Child Wellbeing Study who indicate that they were romantically involved, 50% of those couples also have talked about marriage. But again, there's no intervention there to even help them think about that in a kind of mature way. But we really have to start emphasizing these types of things in the programs that we set up. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Scott Barkin. I'm a second-year MPP student, and I have 2 questions for y'all. I should also preface this by saying I worked for a couple of years for a child support enforcement agency for the state of Maryland. A little bit of experience, and I had 2 striking thoughts for you. One, is what is your opinion about a stronger role for the federal government in child support enforcement?
Could you repeat the last part of that question?
Sure.
Stronger word?
Stronger role for the federal government in child support enforcement.
Okay.
The federal government, at the same time of devolving lots of powers to welfare programs, is struggling with this idea of how do you deal with both interstate child support enforcement and at the same time possibility of sort of economies of scale with the federal government. Maybe they can do some of these things better. And sort of as you're answering that question, I'd be interested in your perspective about all of these efforts to be more community focused and working with CBOs. And sort of there seems to be a dichotomy there, sort of move towards federalization, possibly, and I'd be interested in your opinions on that. But the second question I'd like to just throw up is hear your response, actually, especially Ron Mincy's to Marilyn Ray Smith's question about how do you, that we have to both focus on the fathers and not forget about the moms. And at the same time that the Ford Foundation is spending lots of money on these fathers programs, why aren't they both mothers and fathers programs focusing on how mothers and fathers can be better parents and at the same time getting mothers jobs at the same time we work on getting fathers jobs?
I'll let Marilyn address the first question and Ron will take the second.
Okay. Just to give you a little bit of background, the federal government passes laws, and Congress passes laws, and the Health and Human Services administers them, requiring states to have certain rules and regulations and laws in their child support program as a condition of getting the federal government to contribute to the welfare program, so that if we don't have the right kind of child support program, they'll take away all our TANF money for us. That's about $500 million a year, so it gets people's attention. The federal government has been playing a stronger role as a result of welfare reform. There was a decision made early on by Congress not to totally federalize the program, but there was still a proposal kicking around to have the IRS take over the program. I can't imagine a worse outcome for everybody. Unfortunately, the IRS agrees, so I don't think that's likely to happen. But what has happened is that the federal government has been convening a lot more efforts to coordinate among states in the interstate arena, and they've been orchestrating a big financial institution data match and conducting the data matches from there. And they have a couple of big databases, a national directory of new hires. Every time that anyone gets a new job, the employer has to report their name to a state agency, and then the state agency reports it to the federal government, and they do data matches. And about the first year that program was in operation, they located more than 1 million non-custodial parents in different parts of the country in interstate cases who had jobs, who were working, on top of the table jobs, who weren't paying their child support. So I think you're going to see an increasingly strong partnership between the federal government and the child support programs at the state and local level without having the federal government actually run the programs. They're really not equipped to go into the local communities and work out the connections with the courts and so on. And particularly, I think, in the world of welfare reform, one of the most amazing things that's happening is the extent to which agencies are cooperating at the state level across barriers. You used to hear all the time about silo. That was kind of, I think Kennedy School probably came up with this term, silo mentality. Well, that's been breaking down a lot. And I think that's what's going to make all these programs effective in the long run. And it's going to be very hard for the federal government to build those kind of connections. And it's been hard enough for us at the state government level to do that. And I've been spending the last couple of years working on it very hard, and we're starting to make some progress. But, we've gotten to work with Stan. It's been a terrific experience, I think, for both of us to learn, the different vantage point. But I think we're heading in the right direction. We still have some fine-tuning to do.
I think your question about why is the Ford Foundation spending money on moms is a typical example of how thick is the public's misperception around these sets of issues. I will never talk about fathers programs. My discussion is always around strengthening fragile families. The question is that we have an apparatus in place to serve mothers and children, and the apparatus that can bring the father into that conversation is at a much lower level of preparation. And what we're simply trying to do is, articulate a vision for services to low-income people that includes both parents, and then to work out particular strategies on the ground to execute that vision. And that's why we have been major supporters of this notion of TEAM, T-E-A-M parenting, which is a way of jointly counseling both the mom and the dad. We have been the major, among private foundations, of asking the question, what does encouraging the formation and maintenance of two parents, what does that mean? And how do you provide services on the ground that do that? And so our programs essentially do not support fathers, they try to support families. And again, it's hard for the public to get it because we've been doing mom and children for 60 years.
Very good. Yes, sir.
I'm Bo Stubblefield-Tave with Apt Associates, and I'd like to actually follow up on just this issue of strengthening families, because it seems to me that we ought to be looking at expanding our definition of what family means and how do we support it. And it concerns me that the discussion so far has focused so predominantly on the issue of paternity as though that is the only definition of family, which, for example, would look at a situation where a mom might have 4 kids and might have 2 or 3 different biological dads, and doesn't talk about how do we then support that family as a family? How do we involve grandparents, other kin, and so on that are often critical in supporting families? And I know that you all are very aware of these issues, but the way the policy discussion is going is, as you said before, very much silo-driven still to my mind, and driven around a sense of family that is very narrowly defined as opposed to inclusively defined. And I wonder, are we looking at reality, and are we trying to develop policy that will articulate a vision that supports the wide variety of families that are out there in a comprehensive, coordinated way?
Want to try that one, Stan? We do need to work on expanding the definition of family. And I think from a program standpoint, in just trying to affect policy, we find that we're going to have to do some significant collaborations. I guess the best example for us is that we came out of a program that basically dealt with women and children. Our program came from Boston Healthy Start, which is a federally funded program to reduce infant mortality in the greater Boston area, basically low income. We're looking at disparities. So how we evolved is that we saw that agencies that were purporting family, their definition of family were women and children, and then didn't include the father. So we knew that the only way that we were able to step forward and try and help change that was that if we were to set up a program, basically, that tries to reintegrate the whole family. And by that, when I say the whole family, it means any entity that allows that fragile family to be strengthened. And do we have a long way to go? Yes. Is the way programs run currently, are they full force on board with this? Not necessarily. But I think we have a start here. I mean, it took a lot just for a program like mine, which really has a lot of grassroots ways of doing business, which is really ingrained in the community, to accept child support enforcement as a partner. It really took literally a year, for us to work through our relationship issues, and a lot of it had to do with trust, because we knew how our clientele would view us partnering with this type of an entity. But reality is that child support enforcement is going to come into the picture. And reality is that most of the agencies that are currently serving families, quote-unquote, women and children, are going to have to come on board, because in the advent of welfare reform, these projects are going to have to somehow figure out how to collaborate their resources and collaborate their efforts so that they can enhance fragile families. Yes, sir.
My name is Daniel Vasquez, and I'm a research associate over at the Graduate School of Business, and I'm one of Professor Wilson's former students back at University of Chicago. And I'm also a single father, and also from the inner city. And just hearing all the all the ideas being thrown around is kind of interesting, because I do kind of take it rather personal, but that's both good and bad. My question is this. Professor Cornel West, who's here, about a year ago, put out a book with, I think, Sylviane Hewlett, I don't remember her last name. It was titled The War Against Parents. And in that book, he positions current policies today as sort of market values, or policies that reflect market values as opposed to family values, as we understand family values. And my question, I guess, to not Professor, but to Mr. Mincy is, at the Ford Foundation, you have this teen parenting initiative and focus that I guess is a recent thing. To what extent has that really been carried out at the federal level, at the state level, and at the local level? And the reason why I ask is this. My baby boy is away from me, and fortunately I have an education that gives me not only the willingness but the ability to pay, and I do pay, and that's not my problem. But there is the financial support, which I think reflects policies that are rooted in market values, and then there's the family values. And what pains me is actually the psychological support, the emotional support that I can't provide right now because I'm up here trying to obtain a doctorate. Can we push that idea of teen families into and reflect our policies? I mean, it's great that you're giving a testimony in Congress, but can states pick up on that? Can counties pick up on that? So that's pretty much my question.
Well, I think, and I really think that what we have to appreciate, first of all, is that people who make policy and people who administer programs, my experience has been that these are serious people who have an agenda for children, who care about their work. But we built institutions for 60 years for doing business in a certain way. And what we're asking them to do is rather radical, really radical. And so I think I fully accept the responsibility of patience and leadership and education. To first of all, to put out the information that says the world is different than the world in which these programs were conceived. Right. One. And then to share a vision about how the world might change, and then to take the responsibility to illustrate that vision by real example involving real people in communities. So I think it is premature to pass a law around teen parenting until we can illustrate on the ground in real communities with real people that they've sort of wrestled through some of the issues in terms of trying to implement such a thing, work them out, and have created some solutions that other people can pick up on. And so again, what I have said over and over to the Congress is, if you really want to encourage the formation and maintenance of two-parent families, we have a 10-site demonstration intended to do exactly that. We're going to have some failures and some successes, and that will illustrate exactly what you need to do in the next round to really get toward that goal. And so I think we have to be deliberate, we have to be rigorous, but we have to be patient. And I fully accept that responsibility, and I think that's the only way we're going to get there.
The only reason, go ahead.
I'm sorry, we're running out of time, so Richard, just make one last point, and then we'll wrap it up.
The only point is this, there's so much focus on the money, which I understand, and I know I'm not your typical case that really can't provide the money. I can provide the money, it's not that, but I can only imagine how many fathers out there who really have such low self-esteem because not only they can't provide the money, but they can't provide that emotional support because they themselves are trying to get their act together, basically. So that's the only comment I want to make.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry, I can't take any more questions. Just like to end by saying that I think there's been a remarkable consensus among the panelists, and it seems to me that there are several important things that came out. First of all, we need to have a new paradigm to deal with families that have formed as a result of out-of-wedlock births. And many of these families are fragile families. A new paradigm for fragile families, as Ron Mincy would put it. And so this would call for programs that emphasize at least three things: jobs, nurturing, strategies to assist responsible parents, and programs to strengthen marriage so that the parents can provide both emotional and financial support for their children. And finally, the third thing that I got from Marilyn's remarks is that the welfare of mothers, fathers, and children are intertwined. And that picks up the theme that we were talking about later. We're not just focusing on fathers or mothers, we're focusing on fathers, mothers, and children. The welfare of mothers, fathers, and children are intertwined. Thank you very much.